Welcome everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming out today and for being here for the panel Mapping Tomorrow: Community, Climate Resilience and the Future of Cities. Our panel is a really great one today. We have with us Sunela Jayawardene, and she's recognized as Sri Lanka's leading environmental architect by Time magazine and India Today. Her award-winning projects include Jetwing, Will Ulya Colombo Court, Rainforest Eco Lodge, Jetwing, Kadu Rekta, Camellia Hills, and several private homes in Sri Lanka and India. I apologize if I butchered a bit of that. All right. So, inspired by Sri Lanka's pre-colonial cultural traditions, her primary design impulse has been serious concern for ecology of sites and sustainability of human habitats. Her work has been recognized internationally, and Echelon has listed her amongst the 50 most powerful women in Sri Lanka. As an environment conservationist and activist, Sunela was the founder and first chairperson of the Federation of Environmental Organizations and an advisor to the government of Sri Lanka. She is the author of The Line of Lanka, Myths and Legends of an Island, which was shortlisted for the Gratian Prize. Her new book, Ravana's Lanka, The Landscape of a Lost Kingdom, was published in August 2024 by Penguin India. Now retired from architecture, Sunela lives in Dunvilla, a rewilded forest on the border of Wasgomuva National Park in central Sri Lanka. Welcome, Sunela.
Thank you.
And next on the panel, we have Marvi Mazhar. And Marvi is an architect and researcher whose practice combines visual culture, spatial advocacy, and interventions. She serves on several advisory boards in government and non-profit organizations. She has completed her master's at Goldsmiths University of London 2021, and presently her ongoing research focuses on representation and production of Karachi's urban and rural coastal periphery and its ecology. She regularly contributes in Dawn magazine on real estate and heritage preservation subjects and has recently co-edited the book Architecture for the Future, MIT Publication 2023 with Elk Krasny and Angela Fritz. Mazhar is currently working in Kyrgyzstan and Georgia as lead architect, focusing on developing infrastructural and management connectivity. Welcome, Marvi. Next, we have Dr. Sadaf Sultan, who is a research fellow in the Cities Cluster at IDS. She has trained, which is at the University of Sussex. She has trained and practiced as an architect and completed a PhD in urban morphology and contested urbanism from UCL's Bartlett School of Architecture. The thematic focus of her work is the socio-spatial investigation of the migrant experience, its impacts on cities, and the implications of rapid urbanization on processes of growth and development, particularly in informal urban settlements. Geographical experience includes South Asia, East Africa, Turkey, and Europe. She uses GIS mapping, which we will want to know more about, tools and spatial analysis to explore urban processes, including displacement, informality, and infrastructure. And last but not least, a very well-known figure in Lahore, we have Raza Ali Dada, who is, amongst other things, a really well-regarded architect and educator in the field. He is currently a managing partner at Nayyar Ali Dada and Associates, and the firm has always been a recipient of numerous awards, including recently the Aghan Award for Architecture. Dada has 10 years and more of extensive experience with various building typologies in New York and in the US. A supporter of eco-conscious practices, he has actively worked on sustainable projects and raising awareness regarding local heritage and in the environment. He is a visiting professor at the Beacon House National University and is on the board of the Lahore Conservation Society. Dada's own artistic interests have led him to work on custom objects such as furniture and lighting, and he is also the co-chair and one of the driving forces of the Lahore Biennale Foundation. Welcome, Raza. Thank you for being here. All right, wonderful. It's really such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I would like to begin with Sunela Jayawardene, who is such an iconic figure in Sri Lanka. Back home, you are really well regarded and one of the pioneers of actually being one. She was one of the first female architects, I think, who was working in conservation in Sri Lanka. Could you speak a little about the work there, and also particularly to the work that you've been doing recently with rewilding and your projects that have to do with environmental conservation, the recent ones?
So, just to give you a little history, the reason I am an environmental architect is because I am first an environmentalist. From childhood, I've been very passionate about environmental conservation, and it seemed the obvious way to go for me to bring environmental conservation into the built environment, and it has now, today, it's something that everybody is recognizing and accepting. Accepting is, when I say everybody, it's not everybody, not enough, but at least it's a beginning. What I have always tried to do is to demonstrate, to give examples of how this can work, how it's beneficial. I've often tried to use what is considered the poor man's material, which is actually very climate friendly when you talk about thatch or earthen walls, and that it can be utilized in very high-end properties. And the reason is because I think society always aspires to be wealthier and be seen as wealthier. And if the high-end properties do use these materials and they're enjoying it and it's successful, then I think there'll be more acceptance, and in the hope that more people will then employ these eco-friendly building materials and methods.
Thank you, but could you also talk about what rewilding is and
Yes.
what you've been doing, your work in rewilding?
So rewilding is actually landscaping with native species, and the objective is really to cool the earth. But in cooling the earth, it's not just a simple, we are not talking just about temperature, but we are talking about retaining water. We are talking of increasing biodiversity, and that can be done best with species which are native to their particular geographic context. So rewilding has been something which I really started practicing maybe 26 years ago at Dunvilla, which is where we've retired. My husband and I have retired to now. And it's incredibly successful. There is actually a noticeable difference in temperature compared to our neighboring properties, which are still pretty barren and use intensive agricultural practices, which I think are really outdated today. We do multi-cropping and rewilding together. And rewilding itself is something which can be practiced, and I have applied it from urban houses to larger resort projects.
What if you don't have any wilderness around you, as is the case with most urban spaces?
So even a balcony would work. You'd increase your biodiversity. You'd bring in things like bees, which have been recognized globally today. But you could also, simple things like, local bamboo species, which are pollution barriers, they're sound barriers, and they're cool. They're always cool. So simple things. I don't think there is a specific space allocation for rewilding. It's just, I think, recognition and application.
Got it. Thank you, Sunela. I now want to go to Raza. And so, Raza, you are a very important figure in Lahore's civil, civic, conservation, and architectural space. You occupy a very important position in that you have been working as an architect, but also with conservation and with urban planning for many years now. And I particularly wanted to ask you about your work, like in terms of, like, let's say the Mall Road. There was this big project that was envisioned about how to make the city more kind of democratic and more kind of communal, because Lahore has many problems. So I would like to love to hear your thoughts about Lahore as a city, as it is growing and expanding, and I mean population, and particularly in terms of how we're going to create a slightly more communal space, and how governance plays into this, because you are on the front lines of that too.
Okay, thank you for
All the questions.
for so many questions
Yes.
that require a couple of hours. But thank you. But generally, I'm going to have to kind of squeeze everything in here. But first of all, it's very important to know the source of what's driving you to do all this, and then. So the source is multiple sources, right? It's the city itself. The city will teach you pretty much everything if you know how to observe and look at it. So first is the city. Then, as you mentioned, my association with the Biennale Foundation. Sorry. So there have been a lot of learnings from the Biennale. And then then you follow and read, words of wisdom by people such as, this illustrious panel. So when you put this thing together, it's not very complicated. It's very, very simple. And for example, you mentioned the Mall Road project. So I'll just talk about that.
Yes, please.
The rest of the practice is all, we just try to do something that's contextual and relevant. That's generally the direction we like to look for. But for Mall Road, it was, it's a very important part of the city. I mean, nostalgia and everything else aside, but you offer it in the right way, public will embrace it, right? So it's how you present it, how you program it, and how you manage it. If you can take care of these three things. So what we tried to do at the Mall Road project, which is currently not a project, maybe it'll come back, was to create spaces for public where people can actually stay. Nobody stays, and if you go there at night at 7 p.m. onwards, or today, there's nothing there. There's nobody stays, nobody does anything there. But if you observe that over an average weekend, more than 100,000 people will come from that side of Mall Road, go through Mall Road, probably go to Fortress Stadium, go wherever. But the only thing left to do in Mall Road is a camel ride and Chaman ice cream. And I think there's nothing urban about both of them. So what we had done was that I had identified at least 6 such spaces where at least every evening you would have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people just enjoying the neighborhood, enjoying the architecture, the space, and just being public. Public doesn't know how to be public anymore. That's another issue, because it has been so long since we had a place where we all stroll and sit together and also interface with the city, its architecture, its history, and all that. So that's what the approach was to the Mall Road project. I don't know what else I have to explain. There were too many questions, I forgot.
No, but so this is really great. So then, there was this idea that you had imagined of the Mall Road being this main artery that connects Lahore, and is such a beautiful space. But like you were saying, it's dead in the evening. There is no way to be public, as you're saying. The city has kind of forgotten that, and then how do you feel like your work with the Lahore Biennale Foundation has kind of helped, perhaps in even a small way, brought the city back to its citizens? Has it done that?
I think it has done that to some degree, more effectively through the biennales than any architectural proposal. And we also have another learning that we were able to identify places and buildings which were of significance but completely unknown to the public. Case in point, Bradlaugh Hall. It was ready to literally collapse. It was very difficult to get permission to do anything in that space. But then we had an artist and we showed films that were about abandonment. And there was also a couple other performances there. And then as a result, it's now under full restoration and people are like, we never knew this place existed. And as a space, it's unique, but it also has history, very important history around the time of partition. So then we discovered that how about reclaiming these lost spaces in the city, and then how do you do that? And then how do you engage people? And us as a Biennale Foundation, obviously we have art and artists and such programming to attract people, and it has worked. And in the previous Biennale, we did the same with the YMCA. The previous generation, like my father grew up, well, I think he spent more time in the YMCA than his home. Everybody used to be there. It was such an active social space, and right now it's like completely forgotten. And also they are marginalized, and we have other social issues. So we made another attempt in the hope that somebody will pick this place up and turn it into something that's more useful and what it deserves to be. So in some ways, again, regeneration completely independently, because the government may or may not be available to do this. But that's what we learned from the Biennale experience.
That you learned, and also in terms of like interfacing, if I may, you made this really great observation about how the interface between citizens and the city is something that the Biennale has been working very actively on, and kind of trying to. So do you feel like those spaces that in those interventions, do you feel like the local community around Bradley Hall has had any kind of impact on their lives, or has it shifted their understanding of the area that they've lived in?
No, it certainly does. People do acknowledge this, and at least during the time of the Biennale, it's open to all public, right? And if you observe, you see everybody taking interest and become part of all of this, and there are millions of questions. Like everybody wants to ask what this is about and what this space is about, and they really like being sort of told, because nobody else does that. There is no excuse for them to go out there and have this exchange where they learn new things about the same old neighborhood that they've been in all the time. So it has been very, very positive. Yeah, that way.
Thank you. Sadaf, I want to come to you and ask you, what exactly is urban morphology? And you talk about contested urbanism and particularly mapping as well. Could you kind of explain to us what your work entails in a slightly more kind of layperson's kind of context?
Okay, so let me start with where I started with this before I kind of come to contested urbanism and urban morphology. I resorted to mapping during my PhD simply because there was very little information about what I wanted to do, very little data, kind of pre-prepared that you could use and then just start the analysis. When I got my hands on a digital map a GIS map of Karachi, it was missing huge chunks of the city that you know are there. So places like Kurangi and Orangi town and Baldia, all of these are unplanned settlements that we would refer to as Kachi Abadis. And they were missing. And we know that they exist, but they were not in the map. So what does one do? And it was hours of just underlaying Google Maps and drawing over them in GIS. But there's a deeper thing in this, in that what the lack of that being present in something tangible is that you're invisibilizing huge populations and their issues. So that brings me to what maps are. They are temporal, so they are a snapshot in time of a place. They are political. So what you show in a map, who's drawing the map, who has sponsored that map, they have the power to decide what is included, what is excluded, whose stories are told, whose stories are left out, what is important, what is not important, and then what is ultimately in the context that we are living in today, what is funded, what is not funded. So this is, I think, where all of this started, and that's kind of bled into the work that I do now, which comes to participatory mapping, which is going into communities like Kachi Abadis and having young people who are essentially mobilizers and activists within their communities map those settlements and kind of foreground what they think are important landmarks, what they think are important concerns, and capture those narratives and kind of invert the power of that map back into the community. So now you've got something tangible that says what's there, what is important to them, and now which they can take to local authorities and say, let's talk about it, and how do we fund this, and how do we make this better? So it's about, first about documenting, then about creating this visual tool that can be used for advocacy. I think that was my kind of journey. In terms of urban morphology and contested urbanism, where I started again was looking at Karachi, looking at the spaces of Karachi, and looking at how the politics that we are all quite familiar with, the ethno-politics of Karachi, how that determined what Karachi looks like today. What is built, what is unbuilt, what is contested, what is safe, what we consider safe, why we consider it safe, what is not safe, and again, why we consider it not safe. So that was kind of looking at, that's what urban morphology and contested.
Can you? It would be great if you could elaborate more on how your work has, like, so when you talk about participatory mapping, what did that do exactly, and who are these people who are these young people, and what are these communities? Are they urban? Are they kind of peripheral to the city? Where was this mapping taking place, and what did it actually do for the city? And why would you think that this is a model that one should use?
Okay, so again, the most recent work that I've done is in Sierra Leone in West Africa and in Bangladesh in Dhaka specifically. So Freetown, which is the capital city of Sierra Leone, and Dhaka in Bangladesh. And we were working in informal settlements or unplanned settlements, again slum areas, in both these cities, and working with community mobilizers, young people, and they were digitizing their informal settlements. So again, through this iterative process of having conversations with them, having them reflect on what is important, not only putting in the roads, which was the first layer of information, but then saying, we've got X number of primary healthcare units, this is a school, this is a field, but also then looking at environmental hazards, for example. Mm-hmm. So in Freetown, it's a hilly city. So one side is the sea and the other side are just hills. So a lot of the time you have informal settlements that are split across either hilly settlements or coastal settlements. Mm. And their location is oftentimes tied to the livelihoods of people within those settlements. So if you're a coastal settlement, you are often fishing people. And if you are in a hilly settlement, you are often quarrying. So breaking stones, and those stones are being used. In both cases, the the environmental hazards were quite different. So in the hilly settlements, they were prone to landslides, and in the coastal settlements, they were prone to flooding, or they go through a process known as banking. So it's a reclamation process where they extend the coast outwards through the use of refuse. So you dump rubbish, then you retain that using tires, and you just kind of keep building this through a process. And a lot of homes within those settlements don't have their own toilets. You have what is known as a hanging toilet, which is situated right on the coast, and it's a communal space, and you go and you use it, and all of that goes straight into the sea. But you're essentially fishing and dumping sewage in the same space. So this is hugely problematic. So what we were able to see through these kind of conversations and these practices of working with these communities where they were mapping themselves is logging what was happening, what was important, what were their own challenges, and how they were going about resolving these issues. In the case of Freetown, this initial kind of foray into participatory mapping was then used to develop what is known as a community cadastre, which is a detailed map that says this plot has this boundary, there are this many people on this plot, and this is what's happening there. And this was then used to go to their local authority and develop what is known as a special planning area. That special planning area meant that now, once that special planning area was kind of, they got permission for that, it means now you can't, it has been regularized. So you can't evict them. It's legal now. But also, at the same time, now they have the facility to plan in certain services. So making sure that you are appointing certain areas for healthcare or hospitals or sanitation. So this started as a small exercise of let's just map your settlement, let's know what is here. Went from this to a process of advocacy to now we are looking at a special planning area where they can potentially have legally certain places allocated and assigned. So it's a really, and I think that's a demonstration of the power of the map and how the map kind of gives power back.
That's fantastic. Can I just ask very quickly, how long did this, what was the length of this project?
I think that this happened across 5 years. The length of the project itself, which was a much larger project, which was looking at accountability and in healthcare and informal settlements across multiple sites. So this was across 4 countries, multiple sites, and so on and so forth. But this was one element within that across 5 years.
Got it. Thank you. Marvi, you are a very known figure in Karachi and in, I mean, not just as an architect, but primarily as a conservationist, as someone who's also very deep in advocacy. Can you talk a bit about Karachi's urban sprawl and the peri-urban particularly? What is the situation there? Could you tell us? Because, we'd love to know what that situation is and how has it become a space where there has been enough intervention? Has there been kind of a support to kind of support Karachi's urban sprawl? I mean, especially with all the ongoing climate disasters that Karachi is at the helm of, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for this question. I'm going to build upon whatever, three participants have talked about, because it really resonates what the practice has been in Karachi for me. My journey, of course, started off with love affair with heritage, old town, conservation, preservation methodologies, which is completely frizzled out, and it's on a divorce level, because you take preservation from an aspect of an intervention, which is the first layer. Within that, there are so many other layers that need to be defined, they need to be understood. Infrastructure is one of them, and it is a very important aspect for Karachi. It is very close to what a decay methodology is. We are constantly now thinking about cities from the perspective of, does Karachi needs development, or does Karachi needs maintenance or repair or a care method? Where does it lie? So that is now primarily where bunch of collectives are thinking how one should look at Karachi. So Karachi, of course, I mean, Sadaf can talk more from the mapping perspective, but the city is growing in nexus. It's not growing in a holistic, and one is not asking for that master plan of like 2020 or 2050, but one is looking into how from micro to macro, how is the city managing? How is the city growing? And when you look at the growth, it's very sporadic, it is very fragmented, it's broken, it is class divided. You can see how south is growing and how the north is not defined. So उससे भी पहले जो बहुत ज़रूरी चीज़ है समझने के लिए वो ये है कि कराची के अंदर कोई एक मेन सेंटर तो है नहीं. Centers now are defined through economic zones, या फिर how I define it in a more public manner, wherever Dolmen Mall is. So कराची में कुछ 6 malls हैं and उसके इर्द गिर्द development sprawl होती है. तो क्या होता है कि there is a mall, then there is a food street that emerges, and around that the economy grows, and that becomes the entertainment hub. What Raza was talking about, like किस तरह चीज़ों को आबाद किया जाता है या रिहेबिलिटेट किया जाता है, पब्लिक स्पेसेस को डेवलप किया जाता है, बिकॉज हमारी इस स्पेशल मेमोरी में वो हम चीज़ें भूल गए हैं. वी हैव फॉरगॉटन व्हाट इट अ पब्लिक स्पेस रियली मीन्स. इट्स नॉट जस्ट अबाउट ब्रिंगिंग इन फूड और ब्रिंगिंग इन स्पॉन्सर्ड स्पेसेस. इट इज़ एक्चुअली how do human psychology navigates in a city. So you look at into neighborhood systems. Unfortunately, in Global South, especially in places like these mega cities are catered towards vehicular movements. People are looking into these high-rise systems and just looking into plots, rather than looking at what does a street mean to that residential zone, or what does that sadak then emerges into the main road. So those mergers are the important political contested spaces of design. And right now, the more not myself just, but like all of like the collective, the architects, we're thinking more, how do cities become walkable? How do cities become navigated for different people, elderly people, younger people? Where are those third spaces? बच्चों के लिए क्या entertainment है? क्या वो महदूद है सिर्फ malls के अंदर, play areas तक? पर what does that reflect onto their psychological growth if there are no parks which are intelligent parks, not just green spaces for you to walk around and वो गोल गोल चक्कर काट के एक track बना दिया है, मगर उस track को भी कैसे intelligent बनाना है? That is the real competition. And उसके अंदर things like what Sunila talked about, rewilding, and talked about how mapping plays a huge role.
Case that like they had been successful in removing Bashir, that kind of the head despot, but he had also weakened to the point that actually other members of the military were able to step in. So when you kind of, after the massacre, the international community were like, okay, this is clearly a situation where we kind of have to step in. And at that, then there was kind of negotiations, and we got to what's called the Transitional Military Council, the Transitional Council. And this Transitional Council was a collection of half military, half civilians. And it was supposed to go for a period of 2.5 years. The military would lead for half, and then the civilians would kind of take over. The military sort of, when it came time to hand over power in 2021, they decided actually they didn't want to hand over power, and there was another coup. And so there's a film called Drums of the Revolution, and I'm going to share a little bit about it.
Being at capacity, what do we need to start thinking of? Because here you have you're creating land, you're eating into agricultural land, you're eating into river banks. What then are the ways that we need to be thinking about how we need to design our cities for them to be more sustainable, but sustainable in the way that it's also kind of democratic, so there's a sense of justice for all. So just a small question. So please, it's a, I know that it's a kind of that's the thing that's on everyone's mind. But Sunela, could we start with you, especially what's happening in Sri Lanka? What is?
Well, I don't think Sri Lanka is very different from any other city in Colombo in Sri Lanka is any different from any of the other South Asian cities. Um, Me personally, I think yes, it's all about the capacity, and what we have failed is to actually put a cap on what the carrying capacity of a city is, and that actually can be defined quite easily in terms of how much water and energy can be provided to a particular area. I suppose the history of cities is we started as settlements, maybe even craftsmen's guilds, which then expanded. And today we have this sort of social value in going to the city without really understanding what that means. And so these urban centers are growing. The city fathers are not putting, or the policymakers are not putting a cap on what this carrying capacity is. And the other thing is, we were talking earlier about how they just keep stacking things up. So you take a, 1 acre plot and just put, 20 floors up, and that's what everyone aspires to, this steel and glass building, to have an apartment there or something. But what if, this is, a pipe dream, but if someone was going to build up, you have a ratio of then perhaps buying the edge of the city and greening that. So you always maintain an equilibrium of the built space against the green space, and keep expounding that through that, green lungs are vital for a city, green spaces are vital. So I think it's the failure to recognize a huge issue, and I'm talking about policymakers failing to realize. I think architects who actually work in this field understand this very well, that this is there is a serious problem with all the life support systems that humanity needs. So if you created a frame, if you created a very clear carrying capacity for every city, and then you implemented that. So that is then I come to the other problem with implementation, because certainly in Colombo there are laws in place, but very easily bought. So developer will, where you're allowed, say, building footprint of, say, 80%, will money will pass under the table and build 100% coverage of a plot, way in excess of what's already been defined by urban planners. So I think there is this failure to really understand that cities, the carrying capacity needs to be defined going forward. I don't know whether it has been done anywhere in the world, but I think it really should be done, and why not start in South Asia? We can do this, and really, I think, put pressure on our authorities to implement the existing good laws.
So my question here would be, what's in it for the authorities? Like, why would they why would they be interested when there is money to be made or there's profit to be made out of kind of expanding outwards? How do you counter that mindset? Because when you're saying that things are at capacity, how then does one visualize or map a city in the way where you're able to cater then for even like things like corruption, because that is something that's kind of really a deep problem in terms of governance.
Yes.
So I'd love to know, Raza, if you could talk about it. Like, in your mind, what do you think? How do you think are like possible like ways in which we can imagine the city to be something that is slightly more sustainable, less ad hoc? Because I believe that Lahore was actually termed as urban sprawl, and buildings of ring roads, etc., have been criticized by agencies like Asia Development Bank and saying that, you know, they're great, but they're also not great because they've eaten into vital agricultural land.
Okay, so I mean, there are many things at play. Like you cite the government or whoever is the regulator. We also have to be careful about over-regulation and also informed regulation. So it's important to first figure out who is taking the ownership of the city. It's very important. And it's not just the government, it's also people who live in the city. If you don't feel to be thriving and to be, you know, a really nice place to be, why don't people put that pressure on you? Because the access is not there, and we've been off the track for such a long time that we've completely lost sight of it. And I don't see how just waiting for the, let's say, so-called government or caretaker of the city to do something is not going to take us anywhere. It's brought us here.
This is correct.
So it's not going to take us anywhere. And plus, who is the owner of the city? What is the city admin like? Do we have a mayor? You guys have Murtaza Wahab who runs around, does things. At least on the surface, there is somebody who's trying to be in charge and trying to address certain issues. But I'm not saying that's a good thing, bad thing, if he's good or not, but it's just a model where there is somebody who's been tasked with hearing out the people and doing something about it. Who do you have in Lahore? We've always had a mayor, but you don't know, right? Now there's not even a proper mayor. It'll be the commissioner or the DC or whoever who has that charge. But do you think he can figure this out? No. With all due respect, he may be a wonderful person, but that's not how you do things. So going back to the Biennale thing, what we've managed to do, and again, this is a long-term thing, and Kutsia, who runs the whole Biennale thing, has now been going to the Civil Services Academy to lecture the future bureaucrats and officers in training about what does heritage mean, why is it important, what about culture, the arts, the urban environment, because nobody told them. That's why education is important, but you have to understand what education means. It's not going to school. So it's a long road ahead, but it's the access. You have to first align yourself with the reality that you are part of nature and you're eating yourself away. Unless you come to terms with that, I don't think you can make a sustainable impact.
Correct.
Raza, to add on to that, I'm just going
Yes,
to
please.
build upon what he just said. We talked about speed yesterday. And speed is a very important factor. Whoever is interested in urban methods and urbanization in general, or if you're interested in cities, मई के महीने में कभी टेंडर डॉक्यूमेंट्स पढ़िएगा जो जून के फिस्कल ईयर के लिए प्रपोजल में जाके बनती हैं, उसमें आपको पता चल जाएगा कि साल में व्हाट द गवर्नमेंट ऑफिसर्स आर थिंकिंग एंड इमेजिनिंग, एंड दैट इमेजिनेशन इज वेरी वर्थ स्टडीइंग, बिकॉज देन यू विल नो एग्जैक्टली फॉर नेक्स्ट 3 years आपके साथ होने क्या वाला है और उस एक साल में क्या होने वाला है जो नेक्स्ट साल बनेगा. बिकॉज इन दैट फिस्कल ईयर दे आर ट्राइंग टू पुट टुगेदर absolutely new projects rather than looking into maintenance, looking at older projects where they are at the moment, what has happened to them. So no one talks about deterioration, no one talks about the decay in the city. People are constantly talking about new buildings. तो जब आप न्यू की बात करते हैं तो उसमें नेचर कहाँ से ऐड होगा? क्योंकि नेचर तो यही है ना, you're designing gardens then. You're not respecting what is existing. So how do you move forward from there? So एक तो ये बात था. दूसरा स्पीड, जिस स्पीड में चीज़ें, क्योंकि यू आर ऑलवेज लुकिंग फॉर योर नेक्स्ट इलेक्शन, उसमें आपको ब्रिज की एक रिबन कटिंग करनी है, उसमें आपको एक्सप्रेसवेज करने हैं, अंडरपासेस करने हैं, एंड क्या होता है हर साल समर्स में वही फ्लड होते हैं, वही टूटते हैं. So we all have to also understand that what development really means to our mega cities. It is not about just connectivity. It is also about what it cuts through and underneath what's happening above that.
I think I want to add something to this element of speed. It is speed that is for optics, because you will build things that can be seen but not necessarily things that are useful. So you will build the speed at which an underpass or or an expressway will be built today in these megacities is astounding. But will those areas get water lines with water in them? Probably not. So the speed of something that is optically valuable for the next election cycle, that is one thing. And the speed at which something useful, a piece of infrastructure that will benefit large masses of your population, that is completely different. And I think that is something that we need to reconcile, which brings me to another point, which goes back to, I think, what everyone has touched on, the city for whom? Because it's not a homogeneous population. We are designing for everyone. So does everyone have access to that room where those decisions are being made, or those tables where those discussions are being had? Is the person who is the headman in a Kachi Abadi sitting next to the policy maker who went to the CSS Academy? That is what needs to happen, because until you understand the problems of the city, you are not designing for the people who are resident in that context, which is one thing. What we are applying are transplanted ideas that have been handed to us by some academic who is sitting in some university in some North American or European university campus, who has no idea what a post-independence, post-colonial megacity that has experienced expansion in a compressed period of time, not only of space but of population. How do they live? What are their problems? What are the things that apply to their geography, to their climate, to their needs? So until you have the relevant people in the rooms making those decisions, you are in trouble, I think, essentially.
Thank you. That was excellent. I do believe we've run out of time, but we have just enough time for one or two questions. So if we could pass, if there's any questions from the audience. All right. Great. Well, then we will be closing this panel on time. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.
Priya, thank you
and
so
thank
much.
you for coming.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you.
Lovely.